You've heard of Klaus's 3-minute dovetail, Cosman's 3.5-minute dovetail. Well, I'm very pleased to bring you the one and only Wood Whisperer 45 minutes or more dovetail. To make the half-blind dovetails for our drawer, you're going to need a few things, starting with the already milled drawer parts. A sharp set of chisels and something to hit them with. A coping saw or a fret saw. A reliable marking gauge. Various squares, doodads, and a sharp pencil. And of course, a good quality fine-tooth saw. Let's rock and roll. A dovetail joint consists of a pin board and a tail board. When it comes to a drawer, the sides get the tails and the front and back pieces get the pins. This picture shows a half-blind dovetail, whose name comes from the fact that you can only see the joint from the side. The other type of dovetails you'll see a lot are through dovetails. In this case, the tails would be visible through the drawer front, and that's not really something we want for our shaker table. So today, we'll be making half-blind dovetails. I start by setting my marking gauge to the exact thickness of my side piece. Now this can get really confusing, so put your thinking cap on. The first line I scribe is on the inside face of our drawer front. This dictates how deep the side piece will be embedded into the front piece. Obviously, we don't want it to go any deeper than the thickness of our side piece, so that's why we're setting our marking gauge to the exact thickness of the side piece. The same setting is then used to scribe a line on the end grain of the front piece. This basically tells us that the tails will be a 1/2 inch long, leaving a 1/4 inch of drawer front material in front of those tails. Our final scribe goes all the way around the side piece, once again dictating the length of our tails. Now while you're watching this incredibly boring footage, I should mention that there are 2 ways to cut dovetails, tails first and pins first. Me, I'm a tails first kind of guy, so let's start laying out our tail board. There are lots of ways to lay out dovetails. Since we have such a simple drawer here, I'm just using my adjustable square. I start by striking a line 3/16 of an inch in from each edge to mark the start of the outer tails. And I suggest using either a 1/2 millimeter mechanical pencil for this or just use a marking knife. Next, I strike a line at 1 1/16 of an inch in, which is the end of our outer tails. And finally, I mark the ends of the inner tail at 1 5/16 of an inch. Now I use a handy dovetail marking gauge to establish the 1 to 8 slope for each tail. At this point, you'll start to see the dovetails very clearly. And just to prevent myself from making any silly errors, I mark the waist area with an X. And now it's time to saw. Using my thumb as a guide, I draw the saw backwards to create a little groove just inside the waist area. Rule number 1, always saw in the waist area. Now as I saw, my primary concern is keeping that saw straight on the end grain. I'll try my best to follow that angle that we drew on the way down, but that angle isn't nearly as important as keeping the saw straight along our end grain scribe line. Now at the bottom of the cut, you just want to make sure that you stop before that cross grain scribe line. Now take your time, enjoy yourself, and cut the rest of those tails. Now with the tail board horizontal in the vise, I can trim off the small end pieces, once again staying inside the scribe line. And now it's time to remove the waste between the tails. A fret saw with its tiny thin blade is perfect for this task. Again, stay inside that scribe line. With the tail board clamped to the bench on a sacrificial surface, I can start the chiseling. All you need to do is put the chisel into the scribe line and chop down. Keep the chisel nice and straight and only chop about halfway. Now flip the board over and do the same thing on the other side. The final cleanup is done using paring strokes. There really shouldn't be much to do here other than cleaning up the inside corners. And now it's time to cut our pins in our drawer front. I need something stable and level to rest the tailpiece on while we transfer the tail locations, and a bench plane is great for this. With the tailpiece in place, I use a square to make sure everything is in perfect alignment, And while holding the tailpiece down with one hand, I trace the tails onto the pin board. Remember, the tailpiece should not be flush with the drawer front. It needs to be back by about 1/4 of an inch and perfectly even with the scribe line that we created earlier. And before I mess something up, I immediately mark the waist areas. Using a small square, I then extend my lines down to the scribe line, and again I mark the waist. Now here's how I saw the pins. This time there isn't much room for error. I keep the blade in the waist while establishing the top line first. Once that gets started, I sight down the vertical line and try to cut as straight as possible. With these pre-cuts in place, it's pretty easy to make the rest of the cut at a 45-degree angle. Our starter cuts will help keep the saw aligned. The rest of the cuts are done the exact same way. With the pin board clamped to the bench, it's time to chisel away the waist. I start by reinforcing the scribe line. Not too much force here, just enough to sever the top layer of fibers. Now approaching from the end grain, a few light taps will release a full chunk of wood. I then go back to the scribe line, and now I can hit the chisel with a little bit more force. Back again to the end grain to release another chunk. And I continue this back and forth process until I reach the scribe line in the end grain. And now we just carefully clean out the corners, and only 2 more to go. And ultimately, this is what you're hoping for. Seems crazy to get it right on the first shot, but if you follow the rule of sawing on the waist side of the line, and you always leave your pencil lines intact, it won't be long before every joint fits on the first shot.